In the 1960s, a man named John was drafted to fight in the Vietnam War. For those who don't know, much of the Vietnam War was fought in the jungles of Vietnam. It could be very close-in, brutal combat. And the jungles of Vietnam could be so dense that enemy soldiers could be only feet from you, and you might not know it until it's too late. So any patrol or mission that's launched into the jungle, the soldiers would really have to keep their heads on a swivel because the enemy could come from any direction at a moment's notice. John had been in Vietnam for a while when he was tasked with a mission by his commander. John and a few other men from his unit and a small contingent of South Vietnamese soldiers would be sent deep into the jungle to place these seismic ground sensors. And the idea was that these sensors would be able to pick up enemy movements and give US soldiers a heads up about where the enemy is coming from and potentially prevent ambushes. It was not an easy mission, and it was extremely dangerous. This small group would be going deep into the jungle, well away from their base and well away from any kind of support. They would have their standard issue weapons, but they would have no heavy machine guns, no artillery, no air support, nothing like that. They knew that they had to do their best to just never be seen by the enemy and hopefully never get into a situation where they were outnumbered because it would not be possible for them to receive reinforcements in time. They're about 2 days into this mission, again, very deep into the jungle, very far away from their base, very far away from anybody who could help them if they got into trouble. And crisscrossing throughout the jungle was a very complex network of trails. And every so often, they would get to an intersection in the trail system, and at certain intersections, they would place one of their sensors that would be able to detect if enemies had been moving through the area. Now, they wouldn't just rush in and place these sensors. What they would do is they would hide in the brush in a spot where they thought they couldn't be seen. And once things seemed to be all clear, John would creep out into the intersection. He would place one of his sensors with his men covering him, and then he would scurry back into the brush and hopefully not be seen. On this particular day, this small contingent comes upon an intersection, and John and his men get into a concealed position inside of the brush where they think they can't be seen, and they wait. And what they're doing is they're checking for any sign of enemy troops or snipers, any sign of booby traps, anything that could give them problems. And John is crouched just perfectly still in the brush. By this point, he was an expert at just remaining completely still, sometimes for hours on end, and he's just looking at his surroundings. There they sat for quite a while. Obviously, John always felt fear when he was going out to place one of these sensors, but something about this particular intersection just did not sit right with him. So because of this, they sat much longer than usual as John tried to kind of reconcile why he was feeling this way about this particular intersection. And he was worrying that maybe his subconscious was picking up on something, some kind of threat that he wasn't able to pinpoint, but maybe something was out there that could cause him harm. But he did not see anything unusual, and all he hears are kind of the normal sounds of the jungle, which could sometimes be quite loud. So eventually John makes a decision to go ahead out into the intersection to place this sensor. So he begins to crawl out of the brush as his men get into position to provide him with cover fire if things go south. And John had just stepped out onto the trail when he stops dead in his tracks. He looks down toward the intersection, crouched only a few feet from the intersection, and maybe only 20 or 30 feet from John is a man. But he's not wearing the normal uniform of an American soldier, and he's not wearing the uniform of a North Vietnamese soldier, or a South Vietnamese soldier for that matter. John can't believe his eyes because the man that he has seen, only 20 feet away, is wearing the uniform of a cavalry soldier from the American Civil War. For those who don't know, right, the American Civil War ended in 1865, and this is 100 years before John found himself in the jungles of Vietnam. It made no sense, but here this man was. This man that John is looking at appeared to be a light-skinned African-American man, and he was wearing just this immaculate blue cavalry uniform. In his hand, he had a repeating rifle from the Civil War, and on his hips he had 2 revolvers, and he also had what looked to be some kind of very strange long and curved club also attached to his hip. John's frozen in place, right, if only for a split second. And he's kind of wondering to himself if he's hallucinating when he starts to see this cavalryman very warmly smile at him. And then this man in the Civil War uniform takes his finger and he puts it up to his mouth as if indicating to be quiet. And then he signals to John to get off of the trail and back under cover. And John doesn't really think about it, but he does exactly as he was instructed. He very carefully crawls off of the trail and back into the brush where he can't be seen. Only seconds later, John begins to hear noises, and it sounds like the very distinct clanking of military gear. John peeks through the brush and he sees enemy soldiers. They had just rounded a corner in the jungle, and now they're only feet from the intersection that, remember, is only about 20 feet away from where John is. John gestures to his men to stay down and to stay quiet, and that he sees the enemy. And he's thinking that maybe this is just a patrol, maybe this is a lone couple of guys that were just scouting the trails, but he watches in horror as the approaching troops come into full view. And it wasn't just 1 or 2 men, and it wasn't a small patrol. He's watching 70 to 80 men come through the intersection that he very nearly just stepped into. And they are fully kitted out for battle. Right? Not only do they have their normal AK-47s, but they have RPGs, they have heavy machine guns, they have mortars. If they notice John's tiny patrol, which is armed only with rifles and grenades and handguns, it is all over. They cannot fight a force this size, and there's no way to get reinforcements out here in time. John just stays as still as a statue. He tries not to blink, he tries not to breathe, he just prays that these men do not see him and that he's well covered by the foliage. And within only a minute or two, the troops disappear back into the jungle as quickly as they had came. John lets out just this huge sigh of relief, knowing how close he and all of his men had just come to certain death. But the reason he's alive is because of that mysterious cavalryman. If he hadn't been there, John would have walked right into that intersection just as the enemy troops were rounding the corner. They would have seen him, and they absolutely would have cut him down within a split second. Who was that man? Where did he come from? And why the heck was he wearing a Civil War uniform, a thick and heavy Civil War uniform, in the hot jungles of Vietnam? John decides not to tell any of his comrades about what it was that he saw, and in fact, for years, John never tells a soul about what he saw. He did not want anyone to think he was crazy, and after all, in his mind, he thinks he's probably just hallucinating. Right? Maybe it was the heat of the jungle, or maybe it was the stress of this very dangerous patrol, or maybe it was just something in his subconscious picked up on danger, and that was his brain's way of telling him to get back off the trail, there's danger. Either way, John survives the war, and he comes home, and like I said, he keeps this secret for some time. But a few years after returning, John's grandmother falls very ill, and it's pretty clear to the entire family that she's not going to live much longer. So John came to her while she's on her deathbed, and he sat with her just for hours and hours and talked with her. And they talked about all the good times, and they talked about all the family members that had passed on, and eventually the topic of Vietnam comes up. And John decides, you know what, it's as good a time as any to get this secret off my chest. And he told his grandma about what he saw deep in the jungles of Vietnam, about this mysterious Civil War era cavalryman who saved his life. His grandmother, without skipping a beat, smiles at him and says, "You saw old Red Tom." She explains to him that Red Tom was his great-grandfather. Back before the Civil War, he was a free man who was half black and half Creek native. And when the Civil War started, he became a scout for the U.S. Cavalry, and he later continued to serve after the war in the cavalry out in the American West. He was known for being just extremely brave and going into battle with a Spencer repeating rifle, 2 dual pistols on his hips, and a Creek war club, which was this very long, curved club that he would also wear on his hip. It was his great-grandfather who was watching over him that day and saved his life deep in the jungles of Vietnam. So what do you think about this one? Was John's vision of the Union cavalrymen nothing more than a hallucination that was brought on by stress? Was it his subconscious trying to warn him? Or is it possible that one long-dead warrior could show himself to his great-grandson for just long enough to save his life?